Say a couple words now. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Steve Murray. I'm director here at the Department of Archives and History, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the archives for today's Food for Thought program. Let me ask you to pause for a moment and pull out your cell phone. Go ahead and silence that device to be sure it doesn't ring during the course of today's program. A couple of announcements I'd like to share with you. We invite you to join us virtually online on Monday, March 6th for the next episode in our Research Rundown series. Our reference archivist, Erica Eads, will present Debunking Genealogy Myths. So if you're interested, maybe you're a dedicated genealogist or interested in getting started, this will be a great way for you to become familiarized with our resources here at the archives. Next month's Food for Thought on Thursday, March 16th, will feature historian Dr. James Cobb, who will present what Dr. King didn't say about C. Vann Woodward's The Strange Career of Jim Crow. Dr. Cobb has written a new biography of Woodward, and this will be a fascinating talk. He is a erudite and humorous speaker, so you don't want to miss Jim Cobb. That program will be here in the Farley Auditorium and also live streamed on our Facebook and YouTube channels. We want to thank our good friends at the Alabama Humanities Alliance who make funding possible to support the Food for Thought 2023 program, which is also sponsored by the Friends of the Alabama Archives. Well, you're in for a treat today. Montgomery native Fred Gray graduated from what is now Alabama State University in 1951. He was encouraged by an instructor there to attend law school, and he enrolled at what is now Case Western Reserve University School of Law in Ohio, and then returned to Montgomery upon his graduation. Mr. Gray is an ordained minister. He served as one of the first African-American lawmakers to be elected in Alabama since Reconstruction after passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. He was the first African-American president of the Alabama State Bar. He holds the highest awards given by a number of organizations, including the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the American Bar Association. And he holds a significant number of honorary degrees, including from the University of Alabama and Princeton University. On July 7, 2022, President Joe Biden bestowed upon Mr. Gray the Presidential Medal of Freedom for his contributions as a legal architect of the civil rights movement and a lifelong champion of justice. And we are honored to be able to display the Presidential Medal of Freedom in our lobby here, just down the hall for the past few months. If you did not see that on your way into the building today, I encourage you to stop and see it after the program. I want you to think for a moment about the fact that Fred Gray turned 25 years old a week after the beginning of the Montgomery Bus Boycott. Think about what you were doing when you were 25 years old. We have 7 decades later, we have the extraordinary opportunity not to hear from someone who is not just a witness to those events, but the legal architect of the arguments that carried that movement forward in Montgomery in 1955 and 56, and for years later, and for 7 decades, has been a champion of justice, working for his community and his state, making this a better place for all of us. One of my favorite facts about, I have 2 favorite facts about Fred Gray. One of them is that he shares his birthday with the state of Alabama, December 14th. I think about him every year. My second favorite fact about Fred Gray is that he's been a member of the Board of Trustees here at the archive since 2003. So he is part of the board that provides overall governance and leadership to this institution. And I am sure grateful for the opportunity to call him a boss and a friend. Please welcome Fred Gray.
Thank you very much, Steve. He does an excellent job as the executive director of the Alabama Department of Archives and History. Let's give him and his staff a hand. I appreciate the invitation. I want to specifically thank Ms. Thomas for when you get to be 92, you don't drive like you used to. And she came up to Tuskegee to bring me here. I'm very happy. I want to express appreciation to her for what she does and what she did for me in bringing me here today. My wife, Carol, who I hope is listening and looking at this program today, is not here because she's recovering from rotator cuff surgery that she incurred, unfortunately, when we were coming from an event down in Miami. We both are second marriages. I'd been married to one person for over 40 years. She had been married to her husband for over 30 years. We were introduced by a mutual friend at a church event, and we have been married now for 22 years, and I want to thank her and sorry that she should not be here. This is a very unusual event for me. I don't know whether I have ever been asked to speak at an audience where I had a former governor of the state here. We're good to have Governor Silverman, and I think former Secretary of State. And we're thankful for each one of you who have come here today. Some time ago, I was already invited to accept the invitation to speak here today. The invitation was later confirmed by an email which referred to this lecture as the Food for Thought lecture. I was also asked to have available the books I had authored or co-authored, Bus Ride to Justice, my autobiography, the Tuskegee Syphilis Study, and Alabama versus King, co-authored with Dan Abram and David Fisher. And I understand those books have been made available to you. 2 of them are now out of print, Bus Ride to Justice and the Tuskegee Syphilis Study. We have a new publisher, and if you decide you want some of those other than the ones that they may have here, just let us know and we'll be able to do it. When I realized, when I got this invitation, that is a part of Black History Month, and realizing the racial problems which still exist in this country involving African Americans, Asian, and other minorities, I thought I must mention the fact that this is Black History Month and quote from an opinion written by Emma McAlver Talbot, appearing in the Courier Journal, February 9th, 23 edition, and it kind of expressed my thoughts, and I thought I'd share it with you. And it's about Black History Month. Black History Month is a time to pause and to reflect on the survivals and the amazing accomplishments that Black people have made and continue to make going forward. It would be easy to give up on life in times like these. How easy it would be to bury our heads in the sand. And as we witness the madness of neighborhood villains of every race and stripe, and police officers, criminal politicians, and legislators setback. That's the end of the quote. I thought also that it would be appropriate to talk about the book co-authored with Dave Abram and David Fisher, because it tells the story of what African Americans did here in Montgomery, Alabama in 1995 and 1955 and 1956, when we were confronted with serious problems on the buses. We did not bury our heads in the sand. We just refused to ride the city buses in Montgomery, which resulted in the beginning of what many authors call the Civil Rights Movement and made changes around the world. And guess what? It all started on buses here in Montgomery, Alabama. Give yourselves a hand. Looking back, 68 years after my admission to the bar, I never imagined at the time I represented Claudette Colvin, Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr., Ralph Abernathy, the NAACP, the plaintiffs in Gomillion versus Lightfoot, the men in the infamous Tuskegee syphilis study, the Freedom Riders, the Selma to Montgomery marches, and the plaintiffs in the case that desegregated the schools in Alabama from kindergarten through the universities, that I would ever be invited to co-author with Dan Abram and David Fisher, who are award-winning authors, in writing a book, Alabama versus Martin Luther King. However, it happened. That has been the history of my life, helping to make the impossible possible. When I was approached by them to co-author this book, I was surprised, shocked, astonished, and didn't really believe it would happen. But guess what? It happened. I did not set out to play a role in history. I was just determined to first change the laws in Alabama governing segregation. And as I grew up in Montgomery, Alabama in the late 1940s and 1950s, I came to understand the promises of Americans, where the promise of America were being denied to African Americans like me, solely because of our color and our skin. I knew what the U.S. Constitution said. I knew what the Alabama law said, and I knew for sure that they were not the same. They were different. As I was sitting in the back of buses going back and forth from across the city of Montgomery to what is now Alabama State University, I decided I was going to be a lawyer in Alabama, and I was going to fight segregation anywhere, anytime, and I was going to do that for the rest of my life. And I've tried to do that now for 68 years. My goal was to destroy segregation wherever I found it. At the time I wanted to become a lawyer, I couldn't attend the University of Alabama Law School. But the southern states, in order to keep African Americans from attending graduate schools and professional school at the statewide institutions, they provided out-of-state aid. And I used that out-of-state aid in order to become a lawyer in Alabama. Segregation was and is insidious. It poisons every aspect of African Americans' life. It was designed and applied not simply to control actions, but perhaps more importantly, to create a mindset of inferiority that would limit one's dreams. My mother fought every day of her life for her 5 children, and she died at the age of 97. But she taught the 5 of us and told us we could be anything we wanted to be if we did 3 things. 1, keep Christ first in your life. 2, stay in school and get a good education. And 3, stay out of trouble. I'll try to do all 3. I don't know exactly why I believe that I could rely upon the laws to change the laws in order to fight segregation when the law had been used for so long to make segregation legal. But I did, with a lot of help along the way. I always did, perhaps because we had no other weapons. However, my religious background and my ministerial training gave me the faith and courage that I needed. When I started out practicing law, I had no specific plan as to how I was going to fight for civil rights. When I opened my law office in 1954, there was no national unified civil rights movement. There was no national unified African American leaders. My primary concern at that time was to figure out how I was going to get some clients, because you couldn't advertise, lawyers couldn't like they do now, and pay the $50 a month rent for my office upstairs over Sears at 113 Monroe Street. At that time, there were only one other African American lawyer in Montgomery, Charles Langford, who later became my law partner and who himself had only been practicing law for 1 year. However, I was fortunate enough to be guided by some smart, very determined people within the African American community in Montgomery. Today, many of them are represented by statues, and plaques throughout the city and some throughout the country. At that time, they were just flesh and blood, just like the rest of the African Americans in Montgomery. But they were willing to risk their lives and livelihood in order to obtain equal justice. Many of them are well known, and you've heard of their names, and some of you know some of them. E.D. Nixon, Rufus Lewis, Joanne Robinson, Rosa Parks, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Ralph Abernathy, and John Lewis, for examples. There were others, and so many of the mostly forgotten people mentioned in the pages of Alabama versus King, who stood up when it was not safe and not easy to do so. As I think back, my first civil rights case was representing 15-year-old Claudette Colvin in March of 1955, who had been arrested for refusing to give up her seat on a bus to a white person as required by the Montgomery City Ordinance. I was recommended to her parents by E.D. Nixon. Claudette Colvin attended some of Mrs. Rosa Parks' NAACP youth meetings. She was youth director and secretary of the Montgomery branch of the NAACP. She was a real fighter. Mrs. Parks and I had become good friends, perhaps because she understood the community movement would need good young African American lawyers. For months, we met for lunch pretty much almost every day, so that when she was arrested on December 1st, 1955, for violating the same ordinance that Claudette Colvin, she was well prepared. That day was our last luncheon meeting. The result of her arrest and the subsequent conviction was the mass protests remembered in history as the Montgomery Bus Boycott. Many historians regarded that as the beginning of the civil rights movement. I was right there in the middle of it, and so were some of you. When 89 African-American Montgomery residents were arrested for violating an ordinance against organized boycotts, each of them named me as their defense attorney. Rather than holding 89 separate trials, we accepted the county solicitor's request that we begin with a single trial to determine an outcome that might be applicable in all of the other cases. The solicitor selected Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to be that person tried because he had become really the spokesman for the movement. This was the first civil rights trial of Dr. King's career. When it began, no one, absolutely no one, understood how important it would be in history. That's why you don't have very many pictures of what took place at that first trial. They have a few. I was a young African-American Montgomeryan. I knew from experience not to have any great expectations about obtaining justice on a local level. Even that early in what was to evolve into the national movement, it was my belief that our victories in the war against legal segregation would come on the federal level, and that's where I intended to make my fight in the federal court. This trial, Alabama versus King, began as just another step on a long climb to the promised land of justice for all. And we haven't reached that promised land yet. The county solicitor believed it would not take long to convict Dr. King. The result would serve as a warning to the rest of the African Americans in the community about what was going to happen if they didn't end this protest. While I didn't have much hope of victory, I intended to make the good fight. I knew every African American lawyer in the state of Alabama. I had visited at the invitation of Attorney Thurgood Marshall and with his assistant, Robert Carter, at the NAACP office in New York in December of 1955, when I was retained to represent the people in the bus boycott. And I knew that Alabama would have the best lawyers money could buy, and I knew I would be no match. So I talked to them. They promised me not only to help in connection with the bus boycott, but they would help me in all the other cases so that we could destroy segregation wherever we found, and that continued. Mr. Marshall assigned Robert Carter to assist in Dr. King's defense. I was able to put together an extraordinary team of experienced African-American lawyers, including Arthur Shores, the Dean of Black Lawyers and my mentor, Peter Hall and Ozell Billingsley. I was the youngest member of the team. We worked together to make a statement that resounds through history. When Judge Eugene Carter gavelled the trial to order in March of 1956, Dr. Martin Luther King was the little-known minister of a small upscale church located 1 block from the state capitol. The trial introduced him to America, putting him on the front pages of the Americans' leading newspapers for the first time. The New York Times profiled him as its, quote, man in the news. By the time it ended 4 days later, he was the leader of a new movement that ultimately developed into the civil rights movement. But the trial accomplished far more than that. In defense of Dr. King, actually in defense of the bus protests, we produced a series of witnesses, 40 or 50 of them, who painted a broad, disgusting portrait of segregation that even white America could not ignore. Reading the testimony of those people, it is almost impossible not to feel their personal emotions. And if you get a copy of Alabama versus King, and as you read that testimony, you can almost feel how they felt. Many of them were not educated people. They were people who had grown up knowing their place, second-class citizens for life, but finally given the opportunity to be heard, they stood up, at times defiantly, to the white prosecutors and told their stories their way. Although it took place a long time ago, on occasions I can still hear the distant echoes of that packed courtroom cheering for the people finally given an opportunity to tell their story of their injuries and how badly it was in their own way. The extraordinary bus protests. There had never been anything like it in American history. 50,000 African Americans staying off of buses for 383 days. However, they decided, and it highlighted by the trial to serve as a message to this country. And the message that we sent to the country at that time in 55 and 56 is that African Americans would no longer accept second-class citizenships. For me, like Dr. King, guess what? It was just our beginning. My career took place from the $50 a month office space above Sears Roebuck's at 113 Monroe Street to arguing in front of the Supreme Court of the United States. And almost exactly a decade later, guess what? The New York Times, that had profiled Dr. King as a man in the news, did what? Profiled Fred Gray as a man in the news on May 6, 1966. I was a man in the news. And they said, in describing me, quote, a voice for Negroes. And they referred to me, quoting me as explaining, I wanted to be a lawyer because I felt it would be, if there were more lawyers, then we would be able to change the situations that we were enduring. Well, we did it. Not enough, not yet, but we certainly have made progress. I do not know how many civil rights cases I've fought in my career, but in the ensuing years, I represented many of the giants of the struggle. In addition to defending Dr. King several different times, I also fought for Rev. Abernathy, John Lewis, Hosea Williams, the Freedom Riders, the Selma marches, and the victims of the Tuskegee syphilis study, along with thousands of other persons. It was a case I initially thought eventually, one case that I filed overturning Pleasure versus Ferguson, outlawing segregation on public transportation. That was Browder versus Gale right here in Montgomery. Another failed case of mine outlawed gerrymandering on a racial basis, Gomillion versus Lightfoot, the Tuskegee gerrymandering case. I discussed many of these cases in my earlier book, Bus Ride to Justice. I did what I set out to do: fight segregation anywhere, anytime. I'm now 92 years of age and still doing so. Ms. Thomas picked me up at my office in Tuskegee this morning. But certainly the situation has changed. For example, I'm now working out of my office in Tuskegee, the firm that I started, Gray, Langford, Sapp, McGowan, Gray, and Nathanson PC, located on the appropriately named street, Fred Gray Street in Tuskegee. Something interesting about that, though, that street, Fred Gray Street, connects on the south to Martin Luther King Highway and on the north to Rosa Parks Plaza. There's more. Across the street on the west, the square is where a Confederate monument stands. Our most recently filed civil rights case involved that property. It was filed on September 1st, 2021. As Macon County, a political subdivision of the state of Alabama, et al. Versus Tuskegee chapter of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, et al. What was the purpose of that case? The purpose was of having the court to declare Macon County is the owner of the old courthouse site that the then governing body of Macon County in 1906 gave without any monetary consideration and ordered conveyed to the Tuskegee chapter of the United Daughters of the Confederacy for the purpose of converting the same to a park for white people and for the purpose of erecting a monument to the memory of the Confederate soldiers who fought from Macon County, who were in the war between the states and for no other purpose. The deed further stated that if it was not used for that purpose, then it would automatically revert to Macon County in fee simple. We could have filed that case in federal court like I did Browder versus Gale and Gomillion versus Lightfoot and all these desegregation cases. But I've been practicing law in Macon County, and I have found that the judges of the 5th Judicial Circuit, of which Macon County is a part, were fair judges, and we thought they would rule in our favor. What did they do? On January the 26th, or what did he do? On January the 26th, 2023, and on February 3rd, 2023, a circuit court judge in Macon County, Alabama, entered the following orders. 1, that the property is owned by Macon County, and that's what we had asked it to do. 2, the defendant should remove the monument within 60 days. 3, the motion of the plaintiff, Macon County, for summary judgment is granted, and that's what we asked them to do. 4, the motion of the defendants for summary judgment is denied. And that's what we asked the court to do. Then it concluded by saying, this is a final order. But there's more. Not more that the court has done, but on February the 10th, 2023, the defendants in that case, the Tuskegee daughters and the Alabama division, filed an appeal of those orders to the Alabama Supreme Court. That's where we are today on that case. Let's go back to Alabama versus King. When Dan Abram and David Fisher first approached me to work with them on the book, I mistakenly believed when they first talked to me that they intended to write about Dr. King's highly publicized 1960 case, which I also defended him in. In that case, he became the first person in Alabama history to be prosecuted for felony tax evasion. By that time in 1960, Dr. King was respected around the world, and he knew this simply was another effort to stop his influence from spreading. Supposedly, he had not reported earnings of $1,700 from Montgomery Improvement Association of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. But I was quite pleased when Abram and Fisher corrected me. I had always believed that the civil rights movement started with the protests that Alabama versus King deals with. I am very pleased to be able to bring that long overdue attention to it, not just for Dr. King, but for those other people who found courage to stand up for their rights. During that trial, I took great pride and courage of the ordinary people standing up to injustice. As you read the words, I suspect you will feel, that I've already said, the emotions that occurred in that courtroom 57 years ago. Several symbolic events took place while we were writing this book last year and the year before. And I just want to mention 2 or 3 of them to you before I get ready to consider the possibility of stopping. In December of 2021, Montgomery Juvenile Court expunged Claudette Colvin's conviction of 1955. A month later, the governor of Louisiana officially pardoned Homer Pleasant, who in 1892 arrested for refusing to leave a white-only railroad car in that state. And it led directly to the 1896 Supreme Court decision legalizing segregation. The city of Montgomery has now an African-American mayor, council members, and others. Montgomery County has had an African-American chair of it, and county commissioners, African-American judges, and other persons holding public office. And even the city of Montgomery officially changed the name of the street where I grew up on the west side of Montgomery from Jeff Davis Avenue to Fred David Gray Avenue. And finally, President Biden awarded Fred Gray the Presidential Medal of Freedom on July 7, 2022. And thank all of you for helping to make that possible. Since the protests, there is at least 2 generations of people who have grown up who know nothing at all about the difficulties that African Americans have suffered based on segregation. It is therefore necessary that we have history museums across the country in various communities telling that story. And this is very important to you and something very close to my heart. I am delighted that over 25 years ago, I was co-founder of the Tuskegee Human and Civil Rights Multicultural Center, also known as the Tuskegee History Center, located in Tuskegee, Alabama, which not only show the contributions made to this country by Native Americans, Americans of European descent, and Americans of African descent, all under one roof. It also serves as a permanent memorial for the men in the infamous Tuskegee syphilis study. Finally, it gives a brief history of the struggle that African Americans have had from slavery time to the present. The center needs your help. It has no permanent financial support. But it not only tells about the contributions of Native Americans and European Americans and Black Americans, but it tells the struggle that we've struggled, that we've made. This city and this state has tremendous museums. Most of them have some substantial financial support, but the Tuskegee History Center has no such support. It has been supported by people inviting Fred Gray to come and speak, and instead of accepting an honorarium, they sent a contribution to the Tuskegee Human and Civil Rights Multicultural Center. I am asking the civil rights organizations in this community, for all of you who are interested in equal justice, that museum needs to continue. The doors does not need to be closed, and we need your help, and we are asking you, if you want to know what you can do to help solve other problems that are out there that we have to solve, this is one way of doing it. Now, you have to excuse that for that personal reference. Remember, what I have done and what our law firm has done is changing the conditions in our state by using the laws to destroy laws that were unconstitutional. We still have, and have always had, located in Montgomery, Alabama, a law office. It's in the Bailey Building. The Montgomery Law Office is in the Bailey Building, just 1 block from here. And we're still here and we're still available to serve you when you need the best legal services you can get. Admittedly, we have made substantial and significant progress toward eliminating racism and inequality in this city, this state, and this country. But still not enough, not nearly enough. The struggle for equal justice and for the elimination of racial and inequitable inequality continues. What I'm saying is the struggle we have for equal justice and the elimination of racism and inequality continues. People of goodwill and good intentions are trying, but still we have a long way to go. While the Alabama versus King case took place in March of 1956 and ignited the civil rights movement, the struggle for equal justice continues. The struggle for the right to vote and other constitutional rights began early. As far back as August of 1945, long before the Montgomery Bus Boycott and the Selma to Montgomery March, guess what? Black residents of Macon County, Alabama were filing lawsuits in order to get the right to vote. And they will continue to do that. That's why I suggested some years ago that the voting right trail, which now exists from Selma to Montgomery, needs to be extended to Tuskegee, because the first civil rights cases in this state that I have been able to find started with African Americans filing them in Macon County, which also gives you another reason why you need to support the museum there. I first met Congressman John Lewis, who was from Troy, Alabama, who Dr. King referred to as the boy from Troy, when he was a teenager in 1958, trying to figure out how he was going to afford college. I spoke with him and he wanted our support so that he could go to Troy. Asked Dr. King, the Montgomery Improvement Association was willing to help him, but he was a minor. He had to get his parents' support and authority to file the suit. They said, well, son, we're sorry, but we got to live with these white people down here, and they wouldn't agree. But John Lewis didn't stop. He went on to Nashville, went to Fisk, went to the American Baptist Academy up there, and became one of those great leaders. I spoke with him for the last time in July of 2020, only a few days before he died. We talked about many things and we prayed together. As our conversation ended, I asked him for his thoughts on what we needed to do. And I'm going to share with you what he told me. Brother, he told me, keep going, keep pushing, set the record straight. This book, Alabama versus King, is part of the effort to do just that. So I say to you, as you read this book, as you seek to help end all of the racial problems we have in this country, remember it started here in Montgomery. But what John told us to do, and what I suggest to you, while it started in Montgomery, we need to keep going, keep pushing, set the record straight, do it in a nonviolent manner, and continue to do it until justice rolls down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have time for just a few questions. If anyone has a question they'd like to ask Mr. Gray.
Attorney Gray, a year ago, the Alabama Humanities Alliance honored Congressman Lewis, and they stressed that he not only stood up for justice, but also stood up for forgiveness. Could
I have
you,
good hearing problems, so you probably have to do the next person.
last year, the Alabama Humanities Alliance honored Congressman John Lewis. And they stressed that he not only stood up for justice, but also forgiveness. And when you hear about all the anger in our society today, infrequently do we talk about coming together and forgiving each other. Could you please comment on this issue?
Question on John Lewis and forgiveness. John Lewis, you're a pastor. You can talk about forgiveness.
Well, I think all John Lewis was telling us then is that we need to work together and solve these problems. And I thought at one time, and let me try to answer it this way. When I started out as a youngster, trying to do away with segregation, I thought that the white power structure in Alabama, if once they saw African Americans could do things as well as they could, and sometimes better, that they would change the attitude. And I thought at one point we was moving in that direction. But in the last few years, I have almost become convinced that there are so many people whose heart is not in the right place. If they would do what Jesus taught us to do unto others as I have them do unto you, we'd have no more problems. But they won't do that.
Counselor, how did you overcome the fear that I know you endured during all the threats that were made against you during that time?
Well, actually, as I go back and think about all of these things, I didn't really think about fear. I was too busy with people with these problems of segregation, and I was so busy trying to get all the help I could get to solve the problems that I didn't have time to think about the fear. If I had thought about the fear, that might be one of the things they wanted done. So I didn't think about the fear. I thought about, I've got to get this brief ready, I've got to get this done, and I got to try to see if I can get somebody to help get it done. So we just have to keep working on it. But the struggle continues. But unless we think, and there's so many people now, and there are a lot of Black folks who think that they have made it and who don't realize that they're there because somebody else sacrificed for it. But we all have to decide, one, that we still have a problem. If you don't think we still have a racial problem, we'll never solve it. And then if you don't have a problem, once you decide on the problem, you've got to come up with a plan for getting it solved. And then you have to execute the plan. If Joanne Robinson and I had not, as a Tuskegee bus ride to justice, had not answered Mrs. Parks' arrest, if we had not sat in her living room on the evening of December the 1st and December 2nd and made some plans about keeping people off of the buses on that following Monday of December 5th, there would have been no Montgomery Bus Boycott on December 5th. But we had enough sense to do it. We had enough sense to pass the information on to the local leaders and to the local preachers and let them make the plans, and we sit back and say, isn't that good that we've been able to help us get something started?
We'll take one more question back here, Mr. Gray.
Good morning. Thank you for sharing your thoughts with us and stuff. Going forward, though, in your opinion, do you think that the U.S. Constitution is adequate to, as you say, to keep going forward? And also, do you think in these times it will survive?
do you think that the Constitution is sufficient?
Yes.
I think the Constitution is sufficient. And we have had some Supreme Court justices prior to what we have right now who believe the same thing. But we also have a law which sets out how these persons are, how they are selected. Our democracy, and I'm not sure that this country really realized the seriousness of the problems we're having now. We have some serious problems as to whether or not this country will continue to be a democratic form of government or whether it's going to be a government of men and not of laws. It's serious. And I don't think we realize it. This whole country could change from the way it is now a few years from now. And it's not just about black people and white people. It's about all of us who make up this country. It's all of our problems.
All right, another round of applause for our esteemed speaker today.
Thank you. One final thing. If some of you are really interested in helping us support the center, I have a little card here that I'll give to you and tell you how you can do it, because this is a serious matter. And I want to thank you so much for putting up with me talking for so long and being so personal. Thank you.